Okay, good morning, everybody. It's Monday. Hopefully, everyone had a great weekend and a good Easter. And today we're just going to practice graphing. It's something we haven't done in a while, something that you need practice on doing because even though you won't have to graph or turn in a graph for this year's AP test, they said should be graphing on scratch paper as you are taking your test, and then they'll be asking about your graph as part of the answer. They might say, like, what happened to price level, or what happened to unemployment, or what happened to this, that, and the other. And if you have your graphs, then it's going to be really helpful. So I'm going to give you a scenario. I'm going to pause it, as should you, while I graph my answer, because right now I've got nothing on here. And then you can come back in and check your answers. It's just going to be a couple of questions, a couple of prompts. But here it goes. So first question, and it's going to be a couple of graphs. I want you to draw a money market graph, an aggregate supply and demand with a recessionary gap, and the same scenario, recession, on a Phillips curve. So we're going to have three graphs. One is a money market graph, and there's no way to start off in a recession or anything like that on a money market graph. It's just the way that it is. An aggregate supply and demand graph with a recession, and a Phillips curve with a recession. And then I'll come back with your prompt. So pause it and graph, and then come back and I'll tell you what you are doing to those graphs. Okay, so here is what your graph should start off looking like. We have a money market graph right here with nominal interest rates on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x. Money supply is vertical, money demand is downward sloping, and last week we talked about this at the beginning of the week. And then here on the other side, we have an aggregate supply and demand graph with a recessionary gap and a recession as well on the Phillips curve. And I just put, remember, you can't start off at equilibrium if you're in a recession. So I just put letter A there just so I know that that's where I'm going to get started. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. The Federal Reserve is going to try to close this recessionary gap on both our aggregate supply and Phillips curve with expansionary monetary policy. So you're going to write off what they're going to do with the three tools. Remember, the three tools are buying or selling bonds, raising or lowering the discount rate, and raising or lowering the required reserve ratio. So you're going to pick which one of the three. What are they going to do with bonds? What are they going to do with RR? And what are they going to do with the required reserve ratio? And show how that would affect each of these three gaps. Not gaps, but graphs. Only this one has a gap. Well, I guess that one too. So what are they going to do with expansionary monetary policy? And how do they do that? And what was added to this graph? And then, just for funsies, I want you to write, I've got a, what's it called? I have the back of a bank balance sheet. Okay. And on the back, I just want you to, or wherever you're graphing, I want you to tell me, just in general, what happens to the price level? What happens to the GDP? What happens to the unemployment rate? And what happens to interest rates? Just in general. So tell me the answer to what happens to price level, GDP, unemployment, and interest rates. And you can tell that if you graph it correctly. So pause this and give yourself time to graph. I'm going to graph as well, and then we'll go over our answers. Okay, so hopefully you had time to graph the changes to our money market graph, aggregate supply and demand graph, Phillips curve, and then tell me what happens to price level, real GDP, unemployment, and interest rates. And here's what you should have done. Expansionary monetary policy is when the Federal Reserve will buy bonds, or they will lower the discount rate or lower the required reserve ratio. Remember, buying bonds from a bank gives money to the bank in their excess reserves so they can loan out. So buying bonds increases money supply. So does lowering the discount rate, because the discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges for loans. And if it's cheaper to borrow from the Fed, banks can borrow more money and loan out more money. And also lowering the required reserve ratio is also going to be expansionary monetary policy, because that keeps less money in the required reserves. More money can now be put into excess reserves that can be loaned out. If they do any of these, they're going to do buying bonds because that's their primary monetary policy tool. But if they do any of them, it increases money supply, Where am I? Right here. It increases money supply, and money supply shifts to the right. Ooh, I'm backwards. Shifts to the right, which lowers the interest rate, lowers the federal funds rate, which is the nominal interest rate. If interest rates are lower, businesses can take out more loans and buy more things, as well as you. You guys can take out more loans and buy more things like a car or a house or go to college or whatever. And there's more spending because of all these loans. So aggregate demand shifts to the right, which raises the price level and raises our GDP. A shift of aggregate demand to the right causes movement up on the Phillips curve, and you go from point A on the short run Phillips curve to point B, which means higher inflation, which makes sense because if there's higher prices, the same thing is going to happen to inflation because they're the same, and lower unemployment rates. So in general, expansionary monetary policy raises the price level, raises GDP, lowers the unemployment rate because interest rates fell. And that's what increasing money supply does to the interest rate. I could ask one more thing. I could ask what happens to the prices of bonds on the open market? And bond prices and interest rates are inversely related. So if interest rates just went down, and they did, then bond prices, I guess I could have asked that, bond prices are going to go up. Okay, so I'll give you some time to erase your board if you have a board or anything like that, or get out some more paper because we're going to do one more question. So for our next question, we're going to do basically everything in reverse. We're going to draw a money market graph, an aggregate supply and demand graph, and an inflationary gap this time, and a Phillips curve with an inflationary gap. I want you to write off to the bottom, like we did earlier, what are the tools of contractionary monetary policy? Like what would the Fed do with bonds? What would they do with the discount rate? And what would they do to the required reserve ratio? And then how it would affect the money market graph, aggregate supply and demand graph, and the Phillips curve graph. And then off to the side, tell me what happens to the following: price level, real GDP, unemployment, interest rates, and this time we're also going to add bond prices. So now we're doing contractionary monetary policy, which slows down inflation. Of course, we're going to be starting off from an inflationary gap on aggregate supply and demand and the Phillips curve. And we're going to start by showing what happens to our money market graph that it makes all those effects. So I'm not going to show you how I'm starting off because we just did that. So you should remember how to label everything. If you need to go back and look at what it looked like in a recession, you could probably figure out what it looks like in an inflation, and then we'll go over answers in just a second. So pause, graph some scenarios, tell me what happens to price level, GDP, unemployment, interest rates, and bond prices. Okay, let's go over our answers. So in an inflationary gap, the Federal Reserve wants to slow everyone's spending down. So how they do that is by using the three contractionary monetary policy tools, which is selling bonds, also called securities, also called open market operations, selling bonds, raising the required reserve ratio, and raising the discount rate. All three of these would decrease money supply because if the Federal Reserve sells bonds to banks, they take money out of this bank's excess reserves because the bank has to pay for that bond. And so there's less money in excess reserves to loan out to customers. If they raise the required reserve ratio, that takes more money and puts it in required reserves and also less money in excess reserves to loan out. And raising the discount rate makes it more expensive to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, which means banks are going to borrow less money and have less money in excess reserves to loan out. So they're going to sell bonds. That's their primary monetary policy tool. But if they do those, money supply shifts to the left, raising the nominal interest rate, which is also called the federal funds rate, which is the interest that banks charge each other. And that higher interest rates makes it more expensive to borrow money, which means fewer people borrow money for cars and homes and going out and whatever. Businesses also borrow less money to buy pizza ovens and things like that. So aggregate demand shifts to the left, closing that inflationary gap that we started from. Price level falls, GDP falls, and a leftward shift of aggregate demand creates a downwards movement on the short and Phillips curve. Inflation falls, just like prices did, because they're the same thing, and unemployment goes up. So just to recap, if the Federal Reserve does contractionary monetary policy, prices fall, GDP falls, unemployment goes up, interest rates goes up, and bond prices go down. because these two are inversely related. So that is just a recap of graphing, and just to remind us how to like label everything and what to start from and how to read our graphs to give us, because this is basically what you would type in. If you can't graph on the computer, they would like tell you what happens here, or they would say what happens, and then you're gonna have to graph it and be like, and they'll ask about price level, or they'll ask about bond prices or something like that. And keep in mind, this is open note. The more notes you guys take, the better notes, the more they're going to be useful on the AP exam. If you're just sitting there thinking like, okay, yeah, I'll remember that when I see it, I'll remember that when I see it, it's a whole lot easier to refer to those notes as you're taking it than just try to remember it off the top of your head. So anyway, I enjoy graphing. It's always so therapeutic, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. Have a great day. Bye.